Let us turn to Hebrews 11 for our text. Hebrews 11, 24 to 26. Hebrews 11, 24 to 26. By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he had respect unto the recompense of the reward. Moses was a man born at a pivotal time in the history of God's people. And from his vantage point, he could see both worlds, the world of the Hebrews and the world of the Egyptians. Remember, he had Hebrew parents, Amram and Jochebed, and through their faith and through the actions which came from their faith, Moses was preserved as a little child, so that he could live in the palace of Pharaoh as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. No one knew his real parentage except Pharaoh's daughter, Moses himself, and Moses' parents and his siblings. Pharaoh did not know who Moses really was. If he had known, he certainly would have hated him and probably tried to kill him. And certainly when he found out, he did try and kill him. And Moses therefore knew who the Hebrews were. He heard this from his parents as he was growing up with them for a few years before he was handed over to Pharaoh's daughter to be brought up as her son in the palace of Pharaoh. So Amram and Jochebed had a few years, maybe 5 or 6 at most, to train Moses in the way of the Lord. And then he was brought into the palace of King Pharaoh, and he was given an education among the Egyptians, an education which would have contradicted what he had been taught by his parents at every point, an education of idolatry and wickedness. And yet, Moses remembered the godly instruction of his parents, even while he was in the Egyptian palace. He knew who the Hebrews were. Of course he knew who the Hebrews were. It was often discussed in the palace who these Hebrews were. Pharaoh and the other Egyptians hated the Hebrews. They looked at them with a mixture of loathing and some fear. And Pharaoh kept asking himself, how come they are not destroyed? How come the more they are afflicted, the more they flourish, the more they multiply and grow? What kind of people are they? I have tried so many ways to destroy them, and yet they still seem to multiply and grow. And Pharaoh became more and more cruel in his hatred toward the Hebrews, and the Hebrews became more and more miserable in their earthly life. And it seemed, from all earthly perspectives, that Egypt was flourishing, whereas Israel was cursed. But Moses remembered the instruction of his early years. He remembered the promises of God to the Hebrew people. He had to, because our text says, by faith Moses. And faith always holds on to the promises of God. By faith, Moses has to have some kind of content. He can't have faith unless he knows who God is and what God has done and what God has promised to do for his people. Moses knew that Jehovah was the God of the Hebrews. He knew that Jehovah God had promised salvation to the Hebrew people through the coming seed of the woman who would come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He knew that salvation was coming for this people. He also knew that this seed of the woman would be bruised, would suffer. And he also understood, therefore, that the people of God, through whom this seed would come, would also suffer, because they belonged to the seed of the woman. And so Moses understood then that salvation only will come in the way of suffering affliction. And having understood this, that salvation is going to come to the Israelites in the way of their suffering affliction, Moses makes a choice. A choice which is remarkable. A choice which is, without faith, impossible. Moses chooses to have affliction with the people of God. Notice then, Moses choosing affliction by faith. Moses choosing affliction by faith. Look first of all at the choice, then at the consideration behind this choice, and finally at the reason or reasons for this choice. Moses made a choice, and that was to refuse one thing and to choose something else. There's a positive action and there's a negative action in this choice. Look first of all at what he rejected or refused. He refused, the text tells us, to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He was, at this point, legally the adopted grandson, you could say, of Pharaoh himself. He had therefore a position of privilege, of luxury, and of power. And he understood what he was giving up in refusing to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. But he cast all of it away, all that luxury, all that opportunity, as so much dung. He is an Egyptian prince. He would therefore be waited on hand and foot by servants. He would live in the palace of the king. He would feast upon the delicacies of Egypt. He would be clothed in the finest garments that day could offer. His education was the best you could possibly get in his day. Cultured and educated, Moses had a great advantage over all other people of his day. He was trained in the best wisdom that the world knew, and he was no doubt being prepared for a high position in the government of Egypt. Perhaps he was even in line for the throne itself. We do not know if at this point Pharaoh had any other children apart from this one daughter. A position then of privilege. He could look forward to a very successful career in Egypt. And he was 40 years old at this point. He had come of age. He was in the prime of his life. Two words then sum up what Moses refused. Pleasures and treasures. Pleasures and treasures. Gold, silver, precious stones, and all other kinds of luxuries were for him. Everything that a materialistic soul would desire, everything that our soul by nature desires, were offered to him. Many treasures, many treasures you could have if you were the prince of Egypt. And pleasures, wine, women, song, all kinds of pleasures to titillate all of his fancies. He had power, he had influence. Everything would be given to him, as it were, on a silver platter. He could have the world. But Moses said, no, I will not be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. I reject all of the pleasures and all of the treasures of Egypt. And in rejecting them, he did it decisively, and there was no turning back. He could not say, "Oh, I made a mistake, I want to come back." No, this was a choice. A choice once and for all, which would change his life forever. And think of how difficult this choice was. And think of what the devil was trying to tempt him with to stop him from making this choice. Did he not, after all, owe something to Egypt? After all, Egypt had given him a wonderful education, and was he not being utterly thankless toward that woman who had adopted him, who had really saved his life as a little baby from being killed in the river Nile? Why turn his back on all of that after everything Egypt has given to him? Pharaoh's daughter has raised him as if he was her own son. How would she feel? Hurt perhaps, insulted, maybe angry. And such are the thoughts that the devil will put into our minds if we consider turning our back on the world and following Jesus Christ. What will your family say? What will your friends say? But Moses did not think of those things. He cast it all aside. He was determined not to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Or perhaps the devil tried this one. Moses, I realize that you feel sorry for the Hebrews. But what can possibly be gained if you throw in your lot with them? Can't you perhaps use your influence in the palace of Pharaoh to make their life a little bit better? Perhaps you could influence Pharaoh to be less cruel to them. Perhaps you can put in a good word for them in the palace of Pharaoh. And if you leave the palace of Pharaoh and go and join these miserable people, you'll lose your influence with Pharaoh. And then their lot will be no better than it is now. Or if Moses, you really want to worship Jehovah, you want to turn your back upon the Egyptian gods, that's fine. But why do you have to do it openly? And why do you have to go and join the Hebrews to do it? Why can't you just worship Jehovah in privacy of your own quarters? And why do you have to worship Jehovah exclusively? Can't you worship Jehovah as just one more God in the list of gods that Egypt worships? And such are the thoughts that the devil will plant into our minds when we consider giving up the world to follow Jesus Christ and to confess his name by joining with the people of God in a true church. And Moses cast those thoughts aside also. So Moses gives up the pleasures and the treasures of Egypt. And that's hard enough. But consider what he chose in their place. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God, with the Hebrews who were the slaves in Egypt. It's one thing for an Egyptian prince to come down a few rungs in the social ladder of Egypt and become a normal Egyptian citizen. That would be a step down. But this is much worse. He wants to leave the palace of the Egyptians and become a Hebrew, associate himself with the Hebrews. And what was the situation of the Hebrews at this time? One word: affliction. Affliction. The text says that they were afflicted, which means that they were treated badly.